Alright guys, we're back. It's the next day and I just got done welding up the axle tubes on this Pontiac 8.2 inch rear end, and they are looking good. They're a little sloppy because this is cast iron and my welder's set up for steel, so I mean it didn't really work as well as I wanted it to, but I think I got a pretty clean bead on some of these parts. It's not too bad. But anyways, this rear end is now ready to be disassembled, cleaned, and painted. I am super excited. This is probably one of my favorite and least favorite parts of the job because it does take a lot of work, but the end result is so good. The next step is to take these beautiful red calipers off, take the rotors off so it's just the bracket and the rear end. I have an old cover I'm going to put on here with the extra gasket I had. That way I could just paint on the cover and not care. And then, once this thing is done and painted, I have another cover. Yeah, I'm gonna be putting this thing on here. It is gonna look so slick here. Just imagine it now, that looks great. Wow. This rear end is gonna look amazing. These actually match my valve covers better than that. But anyways, I am super stoked that this rear end is so close to being done. This has been such a long time coming. I mean, ridiculous amount of time to get this thing up and going. But right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these brake calipers off, get this rear end ready for paint. Alright, now that I have the brake rotors and calipers off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and torque all the bolts that hold the axles in. I didn't find any specific torque values for the plates and bolts, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to torque them to the recommended torque spec for these bolts. So I'm just going to get to that. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put this old original cover back on the rear end. That way I could just paint over it and not have to worry about taping this whole area up. And again, not too tight, just so that it covers that up. I did put a gasket in there, but that was just an extra gasket I have. I have 3 gaskets for this thing, so I had 1 to spare. Alright guys, we got the rear end cleaned off with some brake clean. The main ingredient in brake clean is acetone, so that gets rid of all the oil, dirt, grease, and grime that's on these things. So now the next step is to hang it up and spray some primer on it. Alright, now that we got the rear end cleaned up, completely degreased and hung up here, we're going to hit it with some primer. I'm going to do a lot of coats of primer because it's got a lot of little dimples, and I got the filler style primer, so hopefully that'll fill in those little holes and they can be sanded down to relatively smooth. So let's get started painting. All right, we have about 6 or 7 coats of primer on this rear end, and it is looking gorgeous. I did a little face right there just to mess around, but this thing is fully coated. I mean, all the little dimples and stuff have been mostly filled in. It is looking gorgeous. So the next step in the process is to paint this rear end with jet black duplicolor paint. It's just the best paint that works for me. The primer that I used for this is a filler primer, so it filled in most of the little gaps and dimples in the casting of the pumpkin here. So that should make the paint job end up smoother, cleaner, a little bit glossier too. So let's get to painting in black. All right guys, that is the rear end done and painted. We have a nice coat of jet black paint on here. I'm so excited. This rear end is so close to being put back in the car, but right now what we're going to do is we're going to lower it from the straps, put it on the car, wheel it over to the table, and that's where we'll put the final touches on this rear end, which includes a new cover. It has fins on it that match my valve covers, and this thing is just going to be so nice to have in the car. Finally have a locker, finally have 373 gears. I've been lugging this thing around with 255 gears in it, and it's not been favorable. So let's get this thing down, get that new cover on it, and then let's throw it back up in the car. Perfect. So what I'm doing right now is I have a 4x4 and a 2x4, and I'm saran wrapping them together. This way they stay together, and also I'm going to wrap these in a towel so that my rear end doesn't get scratched. And I'm going to put the rear end up on these. That way I have a little bit more clearance to put the cover on, because I noticed when I was putting the cover on to paint it, it was kind of bottoming out on the table, and I kind of don't want that to happen. 2 random rags. Just going to wrap these so that doesn't damage the paint. Then what I'm going to do is lift it up, just slip it right underneath. That way the rear end will have something to sit on. There we go. That is interesting. All of these bolt holes are just slightly off, which is actually very unfortunate, so I don't think I'm going to be able to use this cover. For some reason, this cover is like maybe a ½ inch taller than it should be, so all the bolt holes are wrong. Man, I paid good money for this thing too. Taken ripped off. Watch, it's going to be something like Pontiac 10 bolts have a slightly different cover bolt pattern just because it's a Pontiac. I can almost guarantee that's what it is. So that's one thing that really annoys me about GM back in the day. They had to make every single one of their brands different, you know, to, I don't know, get ahead on each other. But years later, it's screwing me. Well, I made a discovery. Turns out, for 10 bolt rear ends, and I'm assuming 12 bolts as well, you have to enter in the ring size for your covers. So this is an 8.5 inch 10 bolt cover, and I have an 8.2 inch 10 bolt. So all the holes are wrong. I don't know why they didn't just make one cover for all the rear ends, because that would, you know, make sense, but you know, GM. So I'm gonna have to use the stock cover, which is fine. The cover doesn't leak, it doesn't have a giant hole in it, but I was really hoping to use this really cool fin cover. But now I have this fin cover, which sucks because I have nothing to use it on. So I guess now this cover just has to go into my other pile of GM parts that don't fit because Pontiac decided to be different. What I'm doing right now is I'm painting the original cover. I'm painting it just flat black That way I can just get this thing in the car later on down the road. If I want to get a fancy cover for the differential, I can, and I'll make sure to buy the correct one. But yeah, that's just a bummer. I really wanted to use this cover. It's a really cool cover. It matches, again, it matches my valve covers. But what can you do? You know. Alright guys, this is the finished result. This is the rear end all put back together with the brakes on there and everything. I mean, this thing is looking gorgeous. Sadly, I did have to use the original cover, but I had to work with what I had, and plus this original cover did allow me to put this bracket on there that holds the brake line in place. So I'm very happy with how this thing came out. It is a pretty looking rear end. It's not a 4.9-inch or anything, but it still is good looking. Got all new bushings in here. Got all new grade 8 hardware holding this thing in. All the good stuff. I have the trailing arms all installed up in the car. Got some new Bilstein shocks right there. This thing is looking pretty. I fixed up the U-joint over there. I love these shocks, man. These are going to be great. Let's get the rear end over here and hang it up. Alright guys, we have the control arms hooked up and torqued down. We have the shocks on, everything is ready to go. All I need to do is just let it down. There you go. That is set in there. Wow. It's making some odd noises, but that is looking so cool. I'm going inside. Alright guys, welcome back to Kingpin Garage. Today we're going to be wrapping up the rear end on this 71 LeMans. I have to hook up the brake lines, the emergency brake cables, and then we're also going to try to tackle the front suspension, which includes installing new UMI 2-inch drop springs and new Bilstein shocks. So what I have to do is I have to mount up this brake cable, cut it to length, put a new flare on it, and then I can use the brake line that was included with this disc brake conversion kit. So let's get to it. So I think what I'm going to do next is actually hook up the parking brake. That way I just get that out of the way, and then I'll move on to bleeding these brakes. But once those brakes are bled, then all I need to do is put the springs in the front. This thing is almost done. So right now what I'm doing is I'm filling up the rear end with fluid. Now the first thing that you have to do if you have a posi rear end is you have to put in some sort of additive to the oil for the limited slip functionality of the rear end. This is just some friction material Helps the plates grab better and helps the longevity of the rear end. I'm going to put in probably like 3/4 of this tube. Let's see where that gets me. Alright, once you have the friction modifier in, then what you can do is start filling it up with normal oil. I'm using a GL5 8090. It's just what the manufacturer recommended for my locker. So let's start pouring these in. So now the secret to filling rear ends like this is you want to have the car relatively level. You want to fill it until the fluid level starts coming out of the fill hole, because the fill hole is like perfect height. Well, this stuff is thick, so it's going to take a while. Alright, that's it for the rear end. It is full of fluid and friction modifier. This oil is really thick, so it doesn't really soak into anything fast. If you let it sit, it'll soak in, but if it's just on the surface, you can wipe it off quickly and it'll be fine. Now, I think what I'll do next is bleed the brakes. So, get another person out here to help me bleed the brakes. And once that's done, I'll work on the front suspension. Alright, you ready?
Yep.
So pump.
How many?
5 or 6. Then tell me when you're holding.
3, 4, 5 and hold.
Yep.
I'm holding. Pedals dropping.
Alright, pump it again.
1. Hold.
And then you pull the little thing. Things go up, things go back.
Bikes.
So whenever you get new brakes, the rotors come pre-covered in a thin film of oil, and that's to protect it during shipping so it doesn't rust. And what you want to do is you want to remove that protective film before you run the brakes, because if that film of oil is on there, it can affect braking and reduce the life of your brakes. So what you can do is take brake cleaner, put on a rag, and just wipe it off. Yeah, look at that. Look how much oil just came off that. That is disgusting. Check that out. Ugh. That was on this clean looking rotor. So definitely want to make sure that these things are clean. Now, if your rotors do get a little bit of surface rust like mine have, don't worry about it, because as soon as you hit the brakes, it'll scrape that right off and you have a nice clean braking surface. I think that's it, right? Right?
That's it.
Right, Ricky?
Right. Think first or last.
Alright, the next step in the process is to do the front suspension. So what I want to do is unbolt this spindle, drop the lower control arm down, that way I'll have access to the spring and the shock. Then I can just swap them out for my new ones and put this whole assembly back together. Now what you want to do is you want to take a jack, put some upwards pressure on this, that way it takes some load off of the top nut of the spindle right there. Make sure you don't hit the dust shield of the brake. Then you want to remove the cotter pin that's holding that castle nut on. Like that. And then we need to unbolt the sway bar. So that's going to get in the way. Sway bar is disconnected. Now what we can go ahead and do is do some bolt for the shock. Now what we're going to want to do is lower this down. That should. Woo! That is dangerous. Well, there it is, folks. That is the old spring out. Whew. Now remember, doing stuff like this, taking these things out, and if you're not a trained professional, this can be deadly. I got lucky. So, since I'm in here, this would be a great opportunity to start cleaning all of this stuff, but not really a big concern of mine having this thing spotless. Eventually I'm gonna replace these arms anyways. Got the new Bilstein shocks in. Looking pretty nice. What I'm gonna do is put the spring in, get this nice and situated up in there. Now what I can do, since this is all situated, is I can reinstall my brake caliper. I got the shock in there, got all that tightened up. Now, what I have to do, at the top of the shock, the actual rod, actual shock rod, there is a little place where you can put an Allen key. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it in there, prevent the whole thing from twisting, and tighten the nut on top. Nice, all right. Wow, okay, that was honestly more simple than I thought it would be. There you go. 2-inch drop springs and Bilstein shocks installed. Now I just gotta tighten everything up, put some new cotter pins in it, and it'll all be good. Alright guys, I've been working all day long. I have all the parts in the car right now. That includes UMI 2-inch drop springs, Bilstein shocks all the way around, and the new disc brakes and rear end out back. Now I'm ready to fire this thing up, and I'm gonna fire it up just to get all the fluids moving, and then tomorrow I'm gonna go through the whole break-in procedure for my rear end. It's like a whole process. It has to run on the stand, drive up to 25 miles an hour, then stop. Then it has to go drive for like 15 minutes, then stop, and it's like a whole process that is outlined by Performance Fabrication. They gave me a little sheet, told me how to break it in, so that way I can get a good wear on the gears. But this thing right now is ready to start. I'm gonna bring an audience out to view it starting for the first time in a long time. Be prepared.
I slept with this before. Yeah.
Your facial expressions was so good.
It's a little loud. Do you think I have an exhaust leak or something? Wow, that makes me feel a lot better that it runs. Of course, it's still loud. I'll try to make up some pipes tomorrow.
Make up pipes.
Make up pipes tomorrow. Yeah. Alright guys, after a long day of work, this is what I have. These little tiny side pipe things. Terrifying. So this thing looks like it would be loud, but I did hack the muffler full of stainless steel wool, so it should be a little bit quieter, but it's probably going to be pretty loud. So now the next step is to get it mounted up in the car. and that will require some brackets being made up. I think I'm going to use some straps with lug bolts in them. I don't know. Just going to try and make it work with what I got. This thing hasn't even been dropped down on the ground yet, and it is looking killer. It's probably looking better than it does just because I haven't seen this thing sort of together in a long time. Sweet, now all I have to do is fire it up. Alright guys, we just lowered it down onto the ground. Check out the fitment here. It is close. Oh man, this thing is super low. It is looking gorgeous. I'm really happy with the way it turned out. This has been quite a long process just to do the rear end, the suspension, and the exhaust, but it is finally done. Now we have to move on to the next step, which is LS. More that I have to do with this car, so there's going to be new videos coming out very soon. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. We'll see you later.